It was an autumn morning in Tennessee, the kind of crisp air that makes you feel like you could finally breathe again after the long summer heat. The leaves were just starting to turn, a faint orange hue that promised the coming of fall. That was the morning Margaret Sullivan pulled her rusted old pickup truck into the gravel lot of Clarksville Livestock Auction. At 62 years old, Margaret had seen her fair share of hard times. But the past year had been a test. She hadn't expected one that would push her to the brink, and then some. Her husband Robert had passed away just the spring before, after a long battle with cancer. After 38 years together, his loss left a hole in Margaret's heart and in their small 15-acre farm. The kind of hole that was hard to explain to anyone, even the bank. Especially the bank. They weren't interested in her grief. They wanted their payments. The bills had piled up faster than Margaret could deal with, and the reality of her situation was stark. She was alone now, and without Robert by her side. The future seemed less like a promise and more like a ticking clock she couldn't silence. Margaret hadn't meant to end up at the livestock auction that morning. She had come to town to talk to the bank, hoping, praying, for an extension on her mortgage. But the meeting hadn't gone well. The banker was polite, even sympathetic, but the message was clear. Without substantial income or collateral, foreclosure proceedings would begin in 60 days. 60 days. The number seemed to echo in her head as she left the bank, her shoulders heavy with the weight of a future she couldn't control. With tears threatening to spill from her tired gray eyes, she made her way back to the truck. And that's when she saw the crowd. They were gathering at the auction barn, a mix of ranchers and farmers, the kind of folks she'd known her whole life. She hadn't been to an auction in years, not since Robert had been by her side, bidding on cattle together, hoping for a good deal, dreaming of what their farm could become. Those days felt like a lifetime ago now, but something inside her pulled her toward the sounds of the auctioneer, the lowing of cattle, the bustle of people haggling over livestock. Maybe it was the nostalgia, a longing for the days when she and Robert could afford to buy cattle for their herd. Or maybe it was just the simple, familiar comfort of being around the animals that had once been the heartbeat of their farm. Whatever it was, Margaret found herself taking a seat on the wooden bleachers near the back, not really intending to buy anything, just to watch and remember. Maybe it would offer some solace. But as the hours passed and the cattle were sold off for thousands of dollars, she felt more and more like a stranger in a world that no longer made sense. A world where $8,000 for a Black Angus bull was just the going rate, where $2,500 for a bred cow was the norm. She barely had enough for groceries, let alone to make a purchase like that. It wasn't until the auctioneer made the final call for the day that Margaret even considered standing up. "Folks, we've got one more lot," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "This bull's been through some rough times, but he might be useful to someone who's got the patience and the knowledge to give him a chance." Margaret stood up, her heart sinking in her chest as a gate opened and a young bull limped into the ring. He couldn't have been more than 18 months old, but he was painfully thin. His ribs jutted out like they were just waiting to break through the skin. His coat was dull, a sickly brown, and there was no mistaking the limp in his step, his left front leg clearly injured, poorly healed. But it was his eyes that caught Margaret's attention. There was something in those eyes, quiet intelligence, a gentleness that reminded her of Robert's old bull, Old Blue, the one who had been the patriarch of their herd. Old Blue had been strong, proud, and always there, a steady presence on their farm. And this young bull, though clearly struggling, had that same quiet dignity in his eyes. The auctioneer's voice pulled her back into the present. "This bull's about 450 pounds, a lot lighter than he should be. He's got some healing to do, but he's got good bloodlines if anyone's willing to take a chance." Margaret felt her stomach drop. No one was bidding. Not a single person raised their hand. A few cattle buyers shook their heads and began packing up, ready to head home. No one wanted a wounded, underweight bull who would require months of care before he could be even remotely profitable. $40, the auctioneer called out, trying again. Still nothing. $20, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Margaret looked at the young bull again, his eyes locked on hers, as if he knew she was his only hope. And in that moment, something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the same thing that had driven her to make so many difficult decisions after Robert passed, something that felt like hope, something that told her this was the right thing to do, no matter how impractical it seemed. She stood up, her voice barely a whisper over the murmurs of the crowd. "I'll pay $10. The auctioneer looked surprised. He hadn't expected anyone to bid, let alone for such a low amount. But to his credit, he quickly recovered. "I've got $10. Do I hear $15? Silence. Margaret's heart raced. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing in on her, and her mind screamed at her to sit down, to walk away. But her heart refused to listen. "I'll pay $5, she said, louder this time. The auctioneer froze, clearly confused by the backward bidding. But when he saw the look in Margaret's eyes, something shifted. "Sold," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "To the lady in the back for $5. The crowd didn't know what to make of it. They probably thought she was crazy widow with no money buying a lame bull for $5. Maybe they were right. But Margaret didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. When she walked down to the ring to arrange transport for her unexpected purchase, the whispers of the other buyers were hard to ignore. But Margaret didn't hear them. She only saw the young bull's eyes, still watching her, as if he knew he had just been given a second chance. "Hello there, boy," she whispered, her fingers grazing his nose. "I guess we're both starting over." The ride home in her old pickup truck was quiet, save for the occasional shift of hooves in the trailer. Margaret had borrowed a small livestock trailer from her neighbor, Jim Patterson, explaining only that she'd made an impulse purchase. She hadn't told him the price. She hadn't told him about the bull's condition. Somehow, saying it out loud would make it all feel even more impossible. When they arrived at the farm, Margaret backed the trailer up to the barn. The place had once been filled with cattle, but now it was mostly empty. She had only a horse and a couple of goats left, all of them aging and no longer able to provide the income Robert had once dreamed of. As Margaret opened the trailer door, she got a better look at Hope. She had already decided to call him that. His condition was worse than it had looked in the auction barn. His hips jutted out, his leg was swollen, and it was clear he hadn't been cared for in months. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Let's get you settled." To her surprise, Hope responded immediately. Despite his limp, he made his way out of the trailer, as if he knew exactly what to do. Margaret led him to the largest stall and prepared a bed of fresh straw. He drank deeply from the water bucket, confirming her suspicion that he had been neglected for a long time. "I'm going to call you Hope," she said, watching him drink. "Because right now, you and I are both going to need a lot of it." But that night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the weight of the decision still heavy on her. She didn't have enough money to feed herself, let alone a bull who would need the best care to recover. She called Dr. Amanda Chun, the local vet, who agreed to come out the next morning. The next day, Dr. Chun examined Hope, offering a diagnosis that was both hopeful and daunting. "He's young and healthy, but he's severely malnourished. It's going to take months of care to get him back to a healthy weight." Margaret listened, trying not to let the panic in her chest show. Even with Dr. Chin's generous payment plans, there was no way she could afford the thousands of dollars it would take to get Hope back to full health. And yet, as the weeks passed and Hope continued to improve, something in Margaret began to shift. She found herself waking before dawn to care for him, preparing his meals, checking on him at every hour. She started helping Dr. Chun with farm calls around the county. It wasn't easy. The work was physically demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but Margaret felt something she hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose. One winter morning, when Margaret was feeling particularly ill with the flu, Hope did something she could never have expected. He called for help loud, urgent bellows that carried across the farm, summoning Jim Patterson, who came running. He found Margaret collapsed in the barn, too weak to move. Thanks to Hope's instinctive warning, Margaret was saved. As she lay in the hospital, recovering from dehydration, Dr. Martinez told her, "Your bull saved your life. If you'd been there much longer, it could have been too late." Margaret was overwhelmed. Hope had saved her life, and she hadn't even known how much she needed saving. When she returned home, Hope greeted her with a rumbly, joyful bellow, and she knew, without a doubt, that she hadn't just saved him. He had saved her too. Hope's story quickly spread. Soon, she was contacted by a television producer, Patricia Williams, who wanted to feature their story on Good Morning Tennessee. It was a small step towards something bigger, but it was a step nonetheless. And after the interview aired, calls flooded in from people who had been moved by Hope's loyalty and intelligence. One of those calls was from Marcus Thompson, a wealthy businessman with a large cattle ranch. He offered Margaret a job managing a therapeutic program for children with special needs, using animals like Hope to help them heal. The offer was life-changing. Margaret didn't hesitate. She accepted. Hope went on to work with children, changing lives every day with his quiet strength and gentle nature. What started as a $5 purchase became the most meaningful chapter of Margaret's life. And as Margaret sat there, watching Hope interact with the children he helped, she realized she hadn't just rescued him that day at the auction. He had rescued her, too. Have you ever had a moment like that? A decision that didn't make sense at the time, but felt so right? Have you ever found purpose through helping someone or something else? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the most broken things have the greatest capacity for love.